All right, pop culture, welcome to the 1980s decade overview. I had a little Michael Jackson there to get us pumped and ready to go. Know that you will see two videos listed for the 1980s in that I kept recording slightly over my YouTube time limit, and so just to keep it safe, I've broken this one up into two to avoid any viewing issues with time limits. And so let's get started here with our interesting facts. Everything's progressing, increasing as it should as we go through the different decades. The biggest noticeable difference here is average salary has went up quite a bit from our 1970s slideshow, despite minimum wage not changing slightly, and obviously more people and better life expectancy as well. Our unemployment rate is 5.8%. That's not too bad, but you'll see on the what's going on slide that the 80s was kind of a hot, cold time. The beginning of the decade is going to be awesome economic progression. The end of the 1980s is going to be not so good economically speaking. So let's take a look at what's going on. First, know that in the 80s, Americans are tired of politics. It's different tired of politics than it was on our other slideshows. In the 60s, people were very angry with what was going on, and so they became very politically active. In the 70s, people were angry with what was going on, and so they just expressed their anger. Remember, I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore. Or remember, we have the label the me decade, and that kind of people just became more selfish and focused internally as a result of not feeling like they could connect with what was going on in the government. In the 80s, I think that so much turmoil had happened in the 60s and 70s that there's just this desire to feel good about America again, and this return to this very nostalgic feeling about the United States, even though there were still bad things happening in the country and in the world. There was just a desire to kind of purposely forget about all of that, and we'll see that in trends in fashion and music is returned to a very nostalgic of the 50s kind of good old days of economics, the pre-Vietnam Cambodia Watergate feeling. The face of the 80s for our country is our president, Ronald Reagan. There's his picture over on the top right. He was a very famous movie actor in the 40s and 50s. In the late 50s, he gets involved in politics. He's governor of California from late 60s to mid 70s, and is really just a wonderfully well-spoken, charismatic person. And he actually, used those acting skills to his advantage in his presidency. And so, especially, towards the beginning of his first term, very popular president. Actually, within his first term, he wasn't president all that long, and when he survived an assassination attempt. And so, here's this, nice old guy, that's leading our country, and he survives a bullet wound to the chest, and so that just kind of upped his credibility with Americans, his devotion to country, if you will. And so he is popular with the majority of people. We'll get more into that here in a few bullets. One of the biggest things that Ronald Reagan is known for as president is his economic theory. So how cute is that, right? We're going to take economics and his last name, and we're going to make a new word. So Reaganomics is the economic policy purported by Ronald Reagan when he is president in the 80s. And so what is Reaganomics? Reaganomics is in economic theory called trickle-down economics. And so this was this idea of let's return to the pre-Great Depression ideals of economy. And that would mean low government regulation on business, tax cuts, anything of that nature that could stimulate the economy, because if big businesses can do what they want and they don't have to pay taxes to the government, then they should expand and grow and hire more workers. And when more people have jobs, they have money to spend in the economy, and everything, should be relatively positive as a result of that. And honestly, there were a lot of positive things concerning Reaganomics. Interest rates were really low in the 80s. Inflation stayed down. Unemployment, as you saw on the first slide, was relatively low. Like, all of those things fell faster under Ronald Reagan than they had under any president before or after him. The average American family in the beginning of the 80s probably saw an increase in their average earnings of about $4,000. So people are thinking, hey, this guy is awesome, and we like this theory of Reaganomics. There were some cons to Reaganomics, though, in that cutting taxes usually makes people happy, but the government still has to operate, and to operate a government as big as ours costs a lot of money. And so in the 80s, one of the negatives of Reaganomics is that we see our national debt go from about $900 billion at the beginning of the 80s to $2.8 trillion by the end of the decade. And so that means that the government under Reagan's leadership was, spending hundreds of billions of dollars more a year than had previous presidents and previous governments. And so, that's usually viewed as a con of Reaganomics. Another negative that is sometimes attributed to Reaganomics is the homeless crisis that we had in our country in the 80s. And so under Reaganomics, we actually saw an increase in Americans living below the poverty line, and it jumped to about 15%. Reagan got a lot of flack for this, and that he, went on record, when the media or interviewers would ask him about this, he kind of went on record as saying, well, these people, make it their choice to stay out there and not do anything about it, which, might be a true statement for some people that happen to be homeless, but I doubt that all homeless people fall into that stereotype, and a lot of people criticized Reagan for that. And so the trickle-down economic theory worked, but the problem was that it didn't trickle down far enough. And so people living at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder in our country didn't receive any of those benefits of Reaganomics. And actually, we saw an increase in poverty in the 80s. Concerning the economy, the last thing to mention here is the stock market crash of 1987. So this time we call it Black Monday, but it's still happening in October. So October seems to be not a very fine month for the stock market in history. But this was on record the worst stock market crash in history. That's right. The stock market lost more points that day in 1987 than it had in the stock market crash in October of 1929. Americans didn't feel the blow as much as they did in the 1929 stock market crash, because after that, we'd put some safety nets in to assure that we didn't have that kind of impact in future stock market crashes. And so this one was bad, but the overall effects weren't felt as greatly as they were in the 29 crash. Well, how did it happen? Economics can be complicated, but here's the shortened version of it. When we had decrease in government regulation of business as a result of the Reaganomics policy, businesses realized that they could really grow their business or increase their profits, not by expanding what they were currently doing, but by buying up a bunch of smaller companies. And so the age of conglomerates, right, where one big company is big because it owns a bunch of small companies, becomes really popular in the 80s. And how did they get the money to buy up these smaller companies? They would issue bonds that were very high risk bonds, but were awesome payoffs. And so you saw a bunch of people buying these bonds from these companies thinking like, ooh, wow, I'm going to make it rich. This company needs to just borrow some money from me so that they can buy up all these other companies. And so these bonds get the nickname or the label junk bonds, and that it was really just a company's way of getting enough money together to buy up other little companies. And so this all makes the stock market look a lot better and more profitable than it really was. And so at some point, reality is going to set in. And when analysts started looking at the trends in the late 80s and saw, oh, companies really aren't as profitable as they look on paper, people panicked and they started selling their stock in these companies. And when everybody starts selling and nobody's buying, you get a stock market crash. And so the beginning of the 1980s was very economically good for the majority of Americans. And then with that stock market crash in 87, you're going to see a lot of people lose their jobs, a lot of layoffs and downsizing as a result. And so that crash led to the late 80s being kind of an economic hardship for a lot of Americans. And so with our economic discussion here, that will conclude part 2 of your 1980s slideshow. We just have a few more bullets to finish up, so I will see you in part 2. Thanks.